Welcome to another episode of Healthy Living Resources. Today we're going to be talking about home food preservation and really focusing on preparing for the canning season. Welcome back to another episode of our Healthy Living Resources. My name is Treva Williams, and I am an Extension Educator in Family Consumer Sciences from Scioto County. My co-host today with me is Melinda Hill.
Thanks, Treva. I'm Melinda. I'm from Wayne County, up in the Wooster area, also serving as the Family and Consumer Science Educator there.
Today we're really going to be focusing on planning for our home canning season. Right now, a lot of folks are in the process of either planting a garden or you're thinking about all that produce that you're going to be purchasing and you want to preserve to have later on. So as we think about that, the important thing is to make sure that we have all of the equipment that we need to make sure that we're using reliable research-based information as we're making our decisions about the recipes that we're going to be using. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to help you really get started with the home canning season. So it's really important for you to, if you're planting a garden, for you to plan now what you're going to plant and think about how much produce that's going to make, because that's going to help you determine how many supplies you need to purchase and to have on hand. One of the things we need to remember is all home canned food, all home preserved food, needs to be used within approximately 12 to 18 months so that we have the best quality product. We also want to make sure that you're only going to be canning foods that your family truly enjoys. It's really a waste of our time if we preserve a bunch of food only to find out, oh, my family doesn't like salsa, but I've already canned 25 pints of it. So when we talk about those recipes, one of the things we need to do is we really need to focus on making sure those recipes are research-based. And so one of the ways we do that is we need to make sure we're using things that are sources such as the United States Department of Agriculture has a great resource out, which is called the Home Guide to Food Preservation. We also have another online resource, which is called the National Center for Home Food Preservation. They are an excellent resource that you can actually go in and search recipes to use. And then finally, making sure that you utilize all of our wonderful resources we have through Ohio State University Extension. We have a tremendous number of fact sheets that you can utilize to get that research-based information. So when we talk about canning methods, Melinda, one of the things we talk about is the fact that there are a lot of different kinds of canners out here on the market. And so today, I know we're going to talk about a couple of different ones, but we're going to really look at pressure canners. We're going to talk about water bath canners, and then something called an atmospheric steam pressure canner. So what can you tell us about canners?
Thanks, Treva. When we're talking about pressure canners, there's several different kinds on the market. What we are sharing today is one of probably what I consider the most common that folks will probably find reasonably within their communities. This is referred to as a Presto Canner, also as a gauge style canner. So when you're shopping around and looking, there are two major varieties. Is one with a gauge and one with a weight. So people often say, what's your favorite? What kind do you like? And my general response is, well, it depends on if you're a numbers person or if you like to listen. The weighted gauge is going to jiggle. So it's going to let you know when it reaches pressure by jiggling. The gauge is you're going to watch the pressure build in the canner. And so for some, it just depends on what your comfort level is. Which is your favorite?
Personally, I like the gauge because I like to see those numbers, make sure that it's on the right number.
So it just depends on what you're used to. When we're looking at the canner itself, another common concern that we have is we've all heard the horror stories, and are they safe? How do I know that this canner is safe? So as you look at the lid that you would have, on the top, right here, we have this little rubber piece that's called an overpressure plug. If for any reason either your range or the canner should malfunction, this little piece is going to be soft and pliable, and it's going to pop right out so that nothing should happen to cause the canner to overheat in that manner. So we have the exhaust vent here, which is where I want steam to come out of here for 10 minutes, according to my recipe, before I put what's called a pressure regulator on to be able to hold the steam inside the canner. And the other thing that we probably should just investigate is on the inside of the canner lid, we have gaskets for most of them. And I want to make sure that this gasket is soft and pliable. The gasket should not spin freely, but should have a tight fit so that I can have a secure fit onto the canner and hold the steam. So in general, whether I'm talking about an all-American canner, a Presto, or the Miro, which is the weighted gauge, those are the major components of the pressure canner.
So Melinda, why would I even want to use a pressure canner?
Good question. Because there are certain foods that I just can't process any other way than using pressure. And the reason is, when I look at boiling water, remember back in science class, do you remember what temperature water boils at?
I think it was 212, wasn't it?
It is.
Okay.
So, 212 degrees. If I boil it for 2 hours or 2 days, the temperature is still going to be 212 degrees. And that is not warm enough, not hot enough, to be able to kill botulism. And so, in order for us to be able to make sure that the food that we are preparing for our families is safe, I've got to make sure that I process at 240 degrees. And the only way to be able to do that is through a pressure canner at 10 or 11 pounds pressure in the canner.
So what types of foods would that be then?
So anything that is low acid. So I'm talking about any of my meats,
Okay.
any of my soups, any of my low acid vegetables. So in essence, all vegetables are low acid, all right? So I can't do green beans in a boiling water bath. I have to do it in a pressure canner. Potatoes, carrots, peas, asparagus, whatever garden variety vegetables that you have, I've got to be able to do them safely in the pressure canner.
So if we're planning on planting vegetables and we're going to can them, then we need to make sure that we're going to be using a pressure canner.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I would encourage, if this is a first adventure for you, is either work alongside someone who has the experience or get one and practice now. Just put water in the canner, put water in your jars, figure out on your range top how long does it take it to come to pressure, how long does it process, what does it sound like, what does it feel like, so that I am comfortable with the process when my product is ready to go. That's not the time to begin to experiment and then be frustrated when things don't work out. And here's another kind of canner that we refer to often as a boiling water bath canner. Many times you'll see it in the granite ware. They come in several different sizes, and depending upon the quantity of foods that you might be using, you can pick one that fits your family's needs. On the inside of this, you will notice that there's just a rack where you can hold the jars upright and off the bottom of the canner floor. I didn't show this on the pressure canner, but there was also a rack inside it as well to be able to keep the jars so that they don't bounce against the bottom of the canner.
You told me I used a pressure canner to can vegetables. What do I use this kind of a canner for then?
Well, this is kind of like for everything else. So if I am doing jams and jellies, obviously this is really big for jams and jellies, but if you really like, or, if I'm doing like apple butter or something that I want in a large quart jar, or any of the things that have acid added to them. So salsas, anything that's pickled. So anything with vinegar.
So if I make my sauerkraut from my cabbage that I'm growing in my garden.
Correct.
I would use
boiling water bath. Okay. The other thing that I think the boiling water bath is a great place to start, because many of the preparation for our product is the same as with the pressure canner. This is just sometimes a little more comforting or a little easier for our individuals to practice with. I don't think I mentioned fruits. That is one of the main reasons that people use our boiling water bath, is our peaches and our pears and our cherries and all of those things that are probably coming about here fairly soon that we want to be able to preserve and have for our families during the winter months. Well, we've talked about the big pieces of equipment, the canners. Treva, let's talk about the jars and some of the other things that are really helpful for us as we begin processing our home food.
Sure. So one of the things we have to remember is most of our fruits and our vegetables are going to be canned in pints or quart jars. Even though they make half-gallon jars out there, the only thing we really use a half-gallon jar for is when we can juice. So everything else is going to be in our smaller jars. So today we have some different sized jars here to kind of give you an example of that. There's the biggest jar here is what we call our quart jar. And this quart jar has what we call just a regular opening, a regular mouth on that jar. The next one is a pint jar. And this pint jar has what we call a wide mouth on the jar. So it has a larger opening on the top of the jar. Makes it actually a little easier, I think, to fill the jars when we're using the wide mouth jars. That's my preference, but I certainly have used a lot of both of them. Now, sometimes I'm going to be canning things such as, say, jelly. A lot of times our jelly or our preserves, those kinds of things, we may can those in smaller jars. And so this is actually a half pint jar. Again, it has the same exact size mouth on the jar as my quart jar has. So it uses the same size rings and lids. And then we also have sitting over there our very small, actually a jelly jar is what it's called. And so this is a very small jar that we could also put preserves. Great for giving gifts, those kinds of things. So one of the things we need to make sure of is that we're only using jars that are approved for canning purposes. So a lot of times you may go find in grandma's cellar all these jars. Well, are they canning jars or not? And one of the things you need to make sure is that most of them are going to have some sort of a name on the jar. It may say a mason jar, or it may have a brand name on the jar. Uh-huh. What we don't want to use are jars that have no names at all on them, because we don't know what kind of jars those are. Did they, years ago, mayonnaise used to come in glass jars, and people oftentimes would save those and can in them. But according to our research that we have today, we know that is not a safe method to use. So we want to make sure we're only using canning jars. Now, the other thing we want to check for, though, is to make sure those jars don't have any chips or any rough spots on the top of the mouth. So one easy way to check that is just take your finger, run it around the top of that ring. Is it smooth? Or if you feel any sort of indentation or chip on it or anything on the outer edge here, we don't want to have any chips there either, because all of that's going to cause our lids to not seal. And boy, there's nothing more frustrating than to can a bunch of stuff and it not seal. So make sure that the tops of the jars are perfectly clear.
But I can use the jars over and over again, correct?
Oh, absolutely. You can use those jars year after year. We just want to make sure that after we've emptied them, use the produce out of them, make sure we wash and clean them.
Sure.
And then before we start canning, we would sanitize them. So, but no, these, we don't have to throw them away. We use those over and over. However, there is one thing we don't reuse over and over, and that is when we're talking about these lids. So these are lids that we use in our canning. These are for the wide mouth jar. So you can see we can take that, put that fits perfect onto this jar.
And those are referred to as our flat lids.
These are our flat lids, okay? These are one-time use only. We do not reuse these lids. So we want to make sure that we use those, and preparing those lids has changed over the years. So you need to be sure that you have the actual box that the lids come in and read what the directions are on that box and follow those to prepare the lids before you put them on the jar. Because like I said, that has changed a lot over the last several years. We don't reuse the lids because they are designed for one-time use only. So that means that basically once we have heated them and we have the product is in the jar, we've heated the jars, whether by pressure canner or boiling water bath, that seal has gotten hot. Then we can't cool it down, reheat it again, and use the lid again. So one-time use only for these lids. Now, there are lids on the market. We don't have an example of that today, but there is a lid out there now that can be used up to 10 times. So those lids, what you do is they have a place on them. You would mark the lid each time that it is used, and then once you reach that 10th time, when you use that product, you would simply throw that lid away. So you can only use those lids up to 10 times. These lids that we're showing you today can be used one time. The other part of that, putting that lid onto that jar, is using the correct size ring. Now the rings can also be reused over and over again, as long as there is no sign of rust. If you have any rust on the inside of the ring, you need to throw the ring away, because that can again impact whether or not that jar will seal. So when you're putting the lids on the jars, you would put the lid on, put the ring on, and then this is what it would look like as we would get ready to process those jars.
Treva, how tight do I put that ring on?
Oh, that's a really good question, Melinda, because a lot of times people want to tighten those down just as tight as they can get them. And that actually is the wrong thing to do. We need to only tighten those lids fingertip tight, which means I only tighten it to the point that it easily stops. Don't then just say, oh, I think I need to tighten it a little bit more. Stop right then. So we don't need a wrench to tighten them down, just your fingers. We don't tighten them down any tighter than that, because what that does is that doesn't allow the air to escape out of the jar. Because we're putting this food under pressure in the pressure canner, or in the case of the boiling water bath, that air in the jar needs to escape. And it cannot escape if we have tightened those down too tight? So that's a really great question. Thank you for asking that. So there's a couple other tools that I really, I can't do canning without them, okay? So one of them is my lovely funnel. So the funnel is used to put our food into the jars. So notice this fits perfectly into our regular mouth jar. It also fits into the wide mouth jar. This makes it very easy for me to fill the jar with the food that we're going to put in. Kind of keeps the top of the jar from getting so messy also. So these are a great tool to use. My other tool that we use is what we call a bubble wand. So you say, Treva, that looks like a big piece of plastic, doesn't it?
It does.
Yes. Well, what this is used for is to really take all of the bubbles that form in the jar as we're filling that jar, and we put the food in, we put the liquid in. There's bubbles in there.
So the air bubbles.
The air bubbles. We want to get all those out that we can. So basically, we're going to take this bubble wand, slide it down in beside the edge of the jar to release those bubbles so that we don't have a lot of extra air in the jar. Now, you can also use, if you don't have one of the bubble wands, another really easy tool to use, just use a regular plastic knife. Notice I said plastic, not metal. We never want to use a metal jar to remove those bubbles because a metal knife can actually scratch the glass. And so we don't want any little fragments of glass in our food. So be sure you'll use either a plastic knife or use a bubble wand to remove those air bubbles.
So Treva, what's on the other end of your bubble wand?
So Melinda, this is what we call our tool to use to measure headspace.
What's that?
Well, headspace is that amount of space we leave at the top of the jar that we don't put food in, okay?
Okay.
So we do that because we're allowing the air to escape out of our jar. That headspace is that space that basically has no air in it once the jar has been sealed under pressure. So we measure headspace with the edge of this tool. So sometimes the recipe will call for a half an inch of headspace, or it might call for an inch of headspace. So by using the little edges on the edge of this, looks almost like a zigzag on the edge of my wand here. If I put this on the very edge and I measure down into the jar, that gives me 1 inch of headspace. Now, typically with our jams and jellies, it's going to be a half of an inch of headspace, which makes a lot more sense in those smaller jars. So this is what the end of that tool is used for.
And I assume it's really important to be accurate with that headspace so that our processing times are correct.
That is absolutely right, because that's what the research is based on. And so we don't want to try to guess and put it a different amount of headspace. Don't want to try to cram that last few pieces of the product into the jar. My last tool that I use when I'm canning is we call our jar lifter. This is probably the one you cannot do without, okay? Because whether we're using a boiling water bath canner and we're canning that to 212 degrees, or we're using a pressure canner and canning our jars to 240 degrees, those jars are too hot to handle with my hands. So to lift those jars out of the boiling water or out of the water after the canner has come off of pressure, we simply are going to put that around the top of the jar, lift it out of the canner, move that then to our area for cooling. So these are silicone on the bottom of this so they don't dent the rings, and we can easily lift those jars, move them, because the other thing when we're moving those jars, you want to make sure you only move them straight up. You never want to tilt them so that we don't get any product under those lids.
It hasn't sealed at that point.
That's
so
right.
I want to make sure that I have that. And I assume I want a surface that won't be a real temperature shock for those jars as well. So
not only surface, but we also need to think about when we have air conditioners running or fans running, We don't want any air blowing directly onto those jars because those jars will get cooled too fast, and we could actually have jars crack and break. So.
And that's not what we want either.
No, it is not.
So there's a couple of questions that you might be asking yourself. How long can I keep the food that I have processed and worked so hard on the summer? Whether I've water bath or pressure canned, I've done my home food preservation. So Treva, how long can I keep them?
You can keep them actually 12 to 18 months. But one of the things we need to remember is always write the year on the top of the jar so that you know exactly when that was processed. Because sometimes we think we'll remember, but we forget.
You think?
I know we do.
Yes, absolutely. And we all know that the last couple of years it's been really challenging in trying to find canning jars, lids, rings. So when is the best time to purchase them? My advice would be when you see them and you know what your garden is going to look like, or you know what your family's needs are for the summer, please don't buy more than you think you're going to need, but definitely pick them up at the time that they're available so that when you are ready, you've got everything on hand to be able to begin your preservation of your home food. So as we begin our wrap-up, I just want to say that remember, if you've got questions, check out the National Center for Home Food Preservation or USDA. You can also check out fcs.osu.edu to be able to access the Ohioline fact sheets that Ohio State University has. There's so many resources there. And give your local extension office a call. They'll be happy to get you connected to an FCS educator who can answer any of your questions concerning home food preservation.
Thank you for joining us today for another episode of our Healthy Living Resources. We hope you've learned some useful information on home food preservation, and you can use this information as you go through the next canning season.